How many of you would believe me if I told you that you don't need a cookbook or a recipe to bake a cake? Well, not a lot. But how many of you would believe me if I told you that you won't need a cookbook or a recipe to bake any cake in another 5 minutes? Toastmaster for the day and fellow Galileans. There are just 2 rules when you're baking a cake. Rule number 1, 250 grams. Rule number 2, weigh it, whisk it, pour it, bake it. Do you want to repeat after me? Rule number 1, 250 grams. Rule number 2, weigh it, whisk it, pour it, bake it. Now, let's start with the most basic cake, a butter cake. Everyone knows that to make a butter cake, you need flour, sugar, butter, eggs, but in what proportions? Now, that's where rule number 1 comes in. 250 grams. You need 250 grams of flour, 250 grams of sugar, 250 grams of butter, and 250 grams of eggs, which is roughly around 3 eggs, but you can always measure it if you want. Now, to a butter cake, you also add a little bit of vanilla to overpower that smell of eggs. You add in 2 tablespoons of milk, and because we are going to bake it, we need to add 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Rule number 1 is done. Then we move to rule number 2, where we weigh the ingredients, whisk them together, pour the batter to a tray, and bake it in the oven. That's how you do a basic butter cake. Now, let's step it up to a chocolate cake. Again, the same rules apply. 250 grams of flour, 250 grams of sugar, 250 grams of butter, and 250 grams of eggs. But this is a chocolate cake. So let's take a little break, sit down on that kitchen chair, and do some primary school mathematics. 4 of 250 grams is 1 kilogram. But this is a chocolate cake, so we need to add in cocoa powder. If we are going to add in more dry ingredients, then our cake is going to be heavier than 1 kilogram, and that's going to mess up all the proportions. So what we do is, we subtract 100 grams out of the 250 grams of flour, and to make up for that, we add in 100 grams of cocoa powder. Rule number 1 is done, and you move to rule number 2, where you weigh it, whisk it, pour it, and bake it. Now, while the chocolate cake is baking in the oven, let's hear a little fun fact about sodium bicarbonate, which is baking powder. When you heat baking powder, it's going to react with all the acids in your cake, and it will give off carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to create tiny little holes in your cake that's going to give your cake that fluffy and soft texture. Are you a fan of coffee cake? Then, if you want to make coffee cake, all you have to do is use the same butter cake recipe, but instead of the 2 tablespoons of milk, now you add 2 tablespoons of instant coffee mixed in water. Do you want to make cupcakes? Well, it's the same recipe. You just need a different tray. When you're familiar with this 250 grams and You're not afraid to be creative and meddle around a little bit. You can just add to and subtract from the butter cake recipe and make absolutely any cake, varying from date cake, fruit cake, banana cake, lime cake, semolina cake, carrot cake, you name it, you can cake it. And take that attitude to everything you do in life. Because some of the most brilliant ideas come from adding to and subtracting from existing ideas. Just like how we made any of those exotic cakes just by using the butter cake recipe and by adding to and subtracting from it. So, don't be afraid to try something new, from when you bake a cake to how you do a speech. But when you bake a cake, don't forget the 2 golden rules. Rule number 1, 250 grams, and rule number 2, you can say it with me, weigh it, whisk it, pour it, bake it. Over to you, Toastmaster of the day.